Good afternoon. I'm BethMehring from University of Virginia, and I'm going to talk to you today about how we integrated telemedicine into our special pathogen care. Specifically talking about Ebola, which many of you have great recollection, I'm sure, of the last 2 years, where Ebola disease was the horrible threat to West Africa that killed thousands of people and became an international threat, so that we did have to prepare here in the United States. University of Virginia was one of the CDC's first 35 treatment centers. We were identified and approved in November of 2015, and our telehealth program figured prominently in this, and that's what I hope to overview with you here today. A little bit about the nursing role specifically. I am an emergency manager by training, so the telehealth world is a little bit different, and I had to pull closely from my colleagues in telemedicine. But from a nursing perspective, we largely had a very unique threat that was posed by Ebola, and we really needed to look to innovative solutions to be able to keep our team safe. And so this is where we developed the term ISOCOMS, where we were able to pull the technology into the actual intensive care unit in multiple settings. I'll go over that in more detail, but basically to be able to limit the exposure to high-risk isolation patients, to be able to use technology-enabled assessment, and then to look at, from our patient perspective, a more human approach so that they were able to actually see humans and not just someone who had extensive PPE in place. And then I'm going to talk about a number of roles of the safety officer who was on the receiving end of the telemedicine. When we first started looking at our program, we looked at what we perceived as barriers to care. And with this, and when we sat down with our partners in telemedicine, we realized that there were many, many opportunities. And in fact, we developed so many case use applications that we quickly realized we needed to have some sense of organization. And so with that, we developed what we call the domains of care related to special pathogens. The first is going to be patient identification. If you can imagine a health system, like I'm sure many of yours, that has well over 180 ambulatory clinics, all doing screenings for patients who have traveled abroad, we needed to be able to have a safe screening process, but the challenge came when we only had 2 hospital epidemiologists. So if there was a positive travel screen, then we needed to have someone who could do a more extensive interview and history with that patient to see if this was someone who was truly a person under investigation or whether they fell outside of the parameters. And so through telemedicine, we were able to expand our 2 epidemiologists to a very broad population. The next domain is patient care, and at this point I'm not going to go too deeply into that because there are a number of slides I'm going to talk about that more. Next, we had patient experience. So again, if you can imagine, patients terribly frightened. They're going to be in an isolation room with basically limited human contact. Everybody that they see has not even 1 square inch of skin showing. Telemedicine allowed our staff to introduce themselves before they came in the room when they were a person, and they established a relationship with the patient, and that was very valuable. So each time before a person went in, they had a conversation with the patient. They could have dialogue with the patient, and this was very important. Additionally, this allowed us the ability to have families communicate, our significant others. It allowed us to be able to have physicians communicate directly. We could bring social work, our chaplaincy services, psychiatry, all the various services that needed to support this patient. The next domain was team health. So you may not be very familiar with the after effect of exposure to true Ebola, but there was the need to monitor our team health. So this included twice-a-day physical checks, as well as the need to check in with the patient face-to-face, or the staff member face-to-face. And so we fortunately did not have to activate this piece, but we had a system in place how we would use telemedicine to achieve this. And then education, we use this in various educational opportunities for our staff. The technology components, I am a nurse, I'm not a technology person, so I'm just going to go over these fairly quickly. But we used a blending of technologies. We used fixed endpoints within the treatment areas in our medical intensive care unit, our ED. We had desktop video conferencing, mobile telehealth where we enabled tablets, especially for our physician team, so they could carry on their normal work and we could pull them in. We had remote patient monitoring that we talked about with the team health. We used collaborative video conferencing, online resources, and then there were innovations with our telemedicine program where even before we started working with them, they were already reaching out to colleagues in Liberia. Brian back there, so that they were putting inexpensive cameras so that they could get this technology enabled to the people who were impacted the most. This image is, before we even started the program, we sort of had to have a proof of concept to be sure we could really make it work. And so with this, there were 4 basic things that we felt like we had to do in order to ensure this system would work. We had to be able to achieve video and audio in the patient's room, at the staff at the nurse's station. We needed to be able to successfully use the remote stethoscope, and we needed to be able to connect the physicians remotely. And we were able in our first effort to be able to effectively do that. The first image that you see up here, this is a view from the patient's bed. We used larger TVs as the monitor, and then we have the camera on top that had the remote capability so that someone from the nurse's station could zoom in, could zoom out, could move around the room, and then for patient privacy could flip it all the way to the ceiling. So there were periods that obviously the patient needed to have some privacy. The image below shows the same view from the patient's bed, but this is an image captured by an iPad with a Jabber connection. And so with this was an example of how our physicians may communicate directly to the patient. We were really pleased that we could increase the amount of physician time with these patients through telemedicine, because as you can imagine, we had a very limited number of physicians who would work with them, but we were able to optimize their time with the patient. Most of our success, I would say, evolved through actual activations. So it was in this process that we had sort of serendipitous discoveries. And I remember this particular day, I'm in the hospital command center, and Brian Goodell from telemedicine was there, and he said, would it be helpful if I pulled all these different windows into one so that you could see everybody? And I said, well, yeah, let's see what it looks like. And this is what it looks like. And in this image, you can see the ambulance that's actually backing up with the patient. We have Dr. Sifri, who's walking with his tablet down to receive the patient. The physicians always like to get a first look at a patient when they are unloaded. Myself in the command center, and then this is the MICU bed where the patient would ultimately go. This picture is particularly of value because this was the actual admission process. So the image to the, let's see, this side, I'm sorry, I struggle with my left and right, is the paramedic from the transport team and the medical intensive care unit nurse doing handoff of care. What's unique in this situation is that that's a lot of perishable information. So Dr. Sifri from outside the room with the headset, he's actually participating in this handoff of care. So in addition to hearing that exchange, watching the admission process, he's actively asking questions and able to participate. Behind Dr. Sifri is the physician who's in charge of our laboratory services. So we're able to bring in many different experts who did not have to physically go into the room. They could manage their specialty from the outside most effectively using telemedicine. And then we have Brian in the top corner who was on site for our admission process, and their team served to troubleshoot for the duration of this isolation, and then myself in the hospital command center. This is a particularly important slide because it shows from the nurse's station in the medical intensive care unit. We quickly recognized the need for a specialty role we called a safety officer. This was another clinician who did not take their eyes basically off the screen for the whole period of time this patient ruled out. This was highly valued by our medical intensive care unit nurses. They felt that they were not alone in the room. I mean, obviously staff had some fears as they were waiting to see whether they were being exposed to a highly infectious disease. And so they felt like they always had a partner there with them. Additionally, they were able to help coach them through some skills that were not the most frequent skills. And examples would include that our safety officer monitored continuously for potential breaches in the PPE, the personal protective equipment, to see if we had any risk for our staff. They were able to see if the nurse or the patient, either one, were experiencing any distress, because obviously I believe it took us 20 minutes to get the person donned in PPE paraphernalia, and about 30 to take it off. So it's not a quick fix to get somebody in the room. We were able to attend to tactical needs, such as what medications are needed next, what supplies might be needed, so that we could carefully orchestrate the trips in the room, minimize exposure. They also serve to coach, to make appropriate communications, and then to document. As you can imagine, with all of the PPE they had on in the room, the ability to document was virtually impossible without the safety officer out front who was doing that for them. One of the things we realized early on was we had not anticipated. We wanted to minimize the number of people in the room for safety. That was a given, but we did not anticipate the shortage of personal protective equipment that would emerge immediately during that period. So it became also of value to be able to minimize the number of people that were going in and out of the room to conserve a very precious commodity. This slide shows what telemedicine, what this would look like, this admission process without telemedicine. This is a view from the nurse's station. You can appreciate an ante room, 2 closed doors, and basically you're not seeing any patient, you're not seeing anything with the monitors, there's no clear communication. And this slide shows what it looked like with telemedicine. So with this, it becomes an interoperative room. And I think, there we go. So in conclusion, what we can say is that this effort far exceeded any of our expectations. We anticipate and have partnered in other ways and look forward to opportunities in the future to work more with our partners in telemedicine. We found that our team members readily adapted. In most instances, most of our nurses had never worked with telemedicine at all, so this was their first exposure. But because so much of the tools that we used were things that they used every day, this was a very easy translation for them, easier than most things, and I think most of you who are in healthcare know what I mean by that. From this, our case uses have exploded. We're looking at many, many ways that we can expand this. It's basically limitless. I would say the biggest limit that we have is the time needed to sit down and develop the implementation strategies. So we have lots of opportunities, but not as much time as I would like. The telehealth enables instant communication. So within emergency services, closed loop communication is paramount. It's important that you give information and you receive information, and it's instant. When I was thinking about this presentation, I mean, obviously you can think, well, it's best to be right there with a person and we can have an immediate exchange. But what we found was telemedicine was even better than that, because through the windows where we pulled multiple people into a common frame, we could pull multiple experts into the same group. We could ensure where we were in process, and I think we made a much, much more efficient and more safe team for a patient, for the general public, and for our staff. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.